Intake manifold gasket on a 2001 Chevrolet 1500 truck. Remove the 8mm nuts for the hose clamps and remove the intake. Remove the 8mm bolt holding on the engine cover. Disconnect the throttle body and disconnect the EGR connector. Remove the electrical connector from the side of the intake manifold. And remove the 3 10mm nuts holding on the throttle body. Remove the 10mm bolts holding on the bracket for the throttle cables. A ratcheting end wrench might be useful for the last one. Wiggle the throttle body off enough so you can get to the heater hoses. Put a pan underneath the motor so you can disconnect the heater hoses. A small slip joint pair of pliers would probably be the best bet for these. Disconnect the alternator connector and remove the bracket holding on the wiring harnesses so they can be moved out of the way. Disconnect the electrical connector on the back of the motor and disconnect the vacuum line on the top of the manifold. Remove the 8mm bolts holding on the EGR solenoid. Remove the EGR solenoid and be careful not to lose the rubber gasket. Take out the 10mm bolt for the EGR tube and firmly pull it out. Remove the clamp for the brake booster vacuum hose and work it off slowly. Pull up on the locks for the fuel lines by inserting a small screwdriver and prying them up. Insert a GM fuel line disconnect tool, push the lines together, and pull them apart to disconnect the fuel lines. Remove all 8 injector connectors by pulling up on the safety lock and then using a small pick to work the connector free. Blow out the engine bay of compressed air and then remove all 10mm bolts around the intake to remove intake. Start in the middle and use a crisscross pattern to avoid warping any components. Once the intake is free, carefully pry up on it and move any harnesses or the EGR tube out of the way so you can wiggle the intake out. Be very careful not to hook anything. And make sure to work the EGR valve out without damaging it. Vacuum out the valley so no debris falls into the intake ports. Carefully clean all the intake ports, making sure that no debris gets into them. Brake clean is best option, and a carbide scraper helps a lot for the residual intake gasket. Remove the gasket by pulling up on the tabs and pulling it off. A small screwdriver might be useful to pry up the tabs. Wipe them clean. Brake cleaner can be used here. Place the new gasket on the manifold. Make sure all the clips clip in securely. Move all harnesses out of the way and carefully work the intake manifold back into its place, making sure that all the bolts are seated properly in the manifold and line up with the corresponding holes. Work the EGR valve in underneath the lines on the intake manifold. Be careful not to damage it. Slowly work it back on. Make sure that the gasket does not get knocked out of place. Once the intake manifold is seated in the valley, before any bolts go in, make sure to get the EGR seated in its hole. Make sure you get a good seal. Then start the bolts by hand. Get them finger tight before tightening further. Some bolts might be hard to get to. It's okay to use an extension with a 10mm socket on it and just tighten it by hand like that. Once all the bolts are finger tight, torque down the EGR tube to 12 Newton meters. Start tightening the intake manifold bolts in a crisscross pattern starting at the middle. Be sure not to over tighten them as we will have to torque them later. An electric ratchet works well for this, just to run them down until they are barely touching. Once all the bolts are run down with an electric ratchet, very carefully tighten them in a crisscross sequence. Just snug them up. Once again, in a crisscross sequence starting from the middle, we're going to torque the bolts. First pass is 5 Newton meters and the second pass is 10 Newton meters. Now reconnect all the injectors. Be sure that they are seated all the way, otherwise you will end up with a misfire. Engage both the clip and the safety clip. A pick might be helpful to pull up on the tab for the connector so it can fully seat on the injector. Reconnect the fuel lines by simply pressing them on until you hear a firm click. Then be sure to insert the safety locks by hooking them and pressing down until they clip. Reconnect the vacuum hose on the back of the intake manifold for the brake booster. Replace a clamp if needed. Those clamps tend to rust and bend as they're being put back on. Reconnect the electrical connector to the back of the intake manifold. Reposition the harness to where it originally was. There are clips on the harness that clip into spots on the intake manifold. Once the harness is resituated, reconnect it on the side of the intake manifold to hold it in place. Put the gasket back on the EGR solenoid before inserting it in, otherwise it will not seat properly. Put the two 10mm bolts back on and just snug them up. Reconnect the vacuum hose to the top of the intake manifold, make sure it is fully seated, and put the 10mm nut back on for the bracket that holds the engine harness on the top of the intake. Now would be a good time to replace the throttle body gasket if you have one, and then put it back on, reconnect the throttle cables to the bracket, and hand tighten the 3 nuts. Just snug up the nuts, not too tight, and put the 3 bolts in for the bracket that holds on the throttle cables. Now reconnect the throttle body heater hoses. A long pair of needle nose pliers might be helpful for getting them on there as it's in a tight space, and it is recommended to replace the clamps on these as they are the clamps that rust and bend. Reconnect the crankcase vent hose, and now it's time to put the intake back on. Make sure it is fully seated before you tighten the clamp, otherwise it will pop back off. And tighten both clamps with an 8mm and put the engine cover back on, again with an 8mm. Top off the coolant and run the vehicle for a little bit and let any air bubbles bleed out that might be in the system.